your Bibles and find the tiny little book of Ruth in the Old Testament. So just right after Judges, before 1 Samuel. It's easy to get lost in there because it's only 4 chapters long. But find the little book of Ruth. And as you do that, I was thinking as I was looking over the book of Ruth last week that it was reminding me when I went to Bible college. I learned a lot of things in Bible college, of course, about the Bible and about ministry, but a lot of other things. And one of the things I learned when I went to Bible college is not everybody goes there for the same reasons. I thought everyone went to Bible college to learn the Bible, to learn about ministry. I found out, number one, some people went to Bible college because their parents forced them to go kind of like reform school. They were tired of these heathen kids, and they thought if we send them to Bible college, they'll be forced to study the Bible and go to chapel, and that didn't always work out. We had a lot of kids expelled in the first 6 months because they were not there for the right reasons. There was another reason some people were there. Some girls were there because they were looking for not only an education in the Bible, they were looking for a husband. And so they would go, and there was a joke on campus that in the girls' dorm, they had a prayer where they prayed 3 things. Lord, give us clean hearts. Lord, give us pure hearts. Lord, give us sweethearts. Those were their prayers there. And because they wanted to find love on campus. And people like love stories. Of all the major, stories and books and films, almost all of them have some kind of a love story involved in that. And I love love stories, especially when they're true love stories. I don't know if you saw this. It was real. It happened back a few years ago. But there was a woman named Mary Stevens. And down in the state of Florida, she had a husband. And her husband had the onsets of dementia and Alzheimer's. And so he was in a memory care facility in a nursing home. And so she went every day to see her husband and would go and sit with him. And they'd go for walks around the care facility. Out of all the things he couldn't remember, he did remember her. And so she would go and they would sit and watch TV. They'd enjoy meals together. But then COVID came. And you know what happened? She showed up one day and the doors were locked and there was a sign on the door that said that nobody could come in, and she called the nursing home, and they said, "No, we're sorry." They said, "This isn't just a nursing home rule. This is a government federal law that they've made that nobody can come into these nursing homes." And she said, "But you don't understand." She said, "He still knows me." And she said, "I'm afraid if I'm not there daily to be with him, he's even going to forget me, and this is going to cause his situation to deteriorate even quicker." And so they said, "We're sorry." They said, "We can't do anything about it." They said, "No one is allowed to come in except employees." And that's when the light bulb went on. She said, "Then can I get a job?" She didn't need a job, but she said, "Can I get a job?" They said, "Well, we don't have any available, but if something comes up, we'll let you know." 114 days went by that she was not able to see her husband, almost 4 months, and she was devastated. He didn't understand. They tried to explain. He didn't understand why, but finally they called her and they said, "We've got a part-time job opening." They said, "But you're not going to like it." They said, "It's mopping floors and carrying out the trash and washing dishes for $9 an hour." And she said, "I'm sold. I'm in. If I can see him, I'm going to do it." And so every day she'd go in and just for a few hours, she'd clean the dishes and mop the floors and carry out the trash. And then she'd go and walk around with him and sit and watch TV. And I thought that was just a beautiful story. And so we come to the book of Ruth tonight. When our country was founded, and the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, one of the famous founding fathers, he served at one time as U.S. ambassador to France. And he got over there in Paris and he joined a literary society where people would talk about great books they had read and the books that they wanted to write and all these sorts of things, kind of kick ideas around. And Benjamin Franklin knew over there in Paris, all these famous, high-thinking people, they were agnostics, they were atheists. They had one thing in common. They hated this book. And Benjamin Franklin loved this book, and he knew that they hated it. And so they were talking one night about all these love stories that they wanted to write and stories they wanted to come up with and books they wanted to write. And Benjamin Franklin told them the story of Ruth. He just told it to them, and that right there in that literary society. And when he was done, everybody in that society said, "Mr. Franklin, you have got to publish that story so the whole world can read it. It's the best story you've got to publish it." He said, "I can't publish it. It's already been published and it's been available to read for thousands of years. It came out of this book that you hate." And the book of Ruth is a great love story. And what makes the book of Ruth such an incredible story is the time in which it takes place. And so to understand Ruth, you start at Ruth chapter 1 and you flip back one page to the last verse in the book of Judges, which says, "There was no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." If you read through the book of Judges, you will probably agree with me. It's a disturbing book to read. It's a disgusting book to see the things that happened and to see how low society had come. And the whole reason God put it in there is to show us what happens when people turn their backs on God and start to do what's right in their own eyes. This is what humanity sinks to. But in those dark and disturbing days of the Judges, we have this story of the book of Ruth because it says it was in the time of the Judges. Right there in the middle, all of this disgusting stuff taking place, there is this beautiful story of hope, which is the book of Ruth. And it starts, and it's very appropriate that we're doing it tonight with all these decorations, because the book of Ruth starts, maybe you remember this, in the little town of Bethlehem. Now, we're going to be focusing on that in the next couple of weeks, and in the little town of Bethlehem. But thousands of years before Mary and Joseph were there and all of that, this little town of Bethlehem was a man named Boaz. I start with Elimelech. There's a man named Elimelech. And Elimelech is married to Naomi, and they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they're living there in Bethlehem, and life is good. Everything's going along just fine. And one day, Naomi goes to make dinner, and she goes to the refrigerator, and it's empty, and she goes to the pantry, and it's empty, and she hops in her car and goes to Aldi and Walmart, and the shelves are bare. There is a famine in the land, and there is no food anywhere. And she comes home and tells Elimelech, there's a famine. It's not just us, all across the land. Now, the reason was, the Bible tells us, because of their sin. Remember the book of Judges, that cycle of sin. Because of their sin, God allowed them to go through this judgment of famine. But Elimelech, instead of praying and for asking God's forgiveness and asking God's blessing, Elimelech does something, and that is he says, let's move. Now, Elimelech knew better than that. His name literally means, my God is king. He was raised by parents who wanted to instill a love for God in their son. They wanted to raise a son who would love and trust God. But Elimelech, instead of getting on his knees and praying and repenting of their sin and asking God to provide, says, Naomi, pack up the house and put a for sale sign in the yard. We're moving. And she says, where are we going? He says, Moab. The country of Moab, 50 miles away. The Moabites were long-term enemies of Israel. They were considered a cursed people living in a cursed land. What in the world would an Israelite be doing in Moab? But he says they've got food down there. So instead of trusting God, we're going to pack up and move to Moab. And so that's what they do. This family of four packs up. They move to Moab. They're down there for 10 years. And at some point throughout that time, as the boys are growing up, they fall in love with two Moabite girls, Orpah and Ruth, and they get married. And in that 10-year period, they go through 3 funerals. Elimelech, the dad, dies. The sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they both die. And so here is Naomi, who has buried her husband and now her 2 sons. And now she's got these 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, and she's sitting down there in the country of Moab for 10 years as it's gone by. And one day she's on her computer and she checks her email, and she gets an email from Bethlehem. And somebody sent it, and they said, Naomi, good news, the famine is over. There's food again. You ought to see the fields out here, the crops that are coming in. And they're going out there to harvest it. We're going to have an incredible harvest. You need to come home. And Naomi goes and tells Orpah and Ruth, she said, all right, I'm going back to my people. I'm going back to Israel. I'm going to Bethlehem. They said, well, we'll go with you. And she says, no, you don't want to do that. She said, I don't have any sons for you to marry. And she said, and even if I were to get married and have a son, are you going to wait till he grows up and marry him? She says, no, you go back to your people. And this is one of the saddest statements that Naomi makes. She says, and to your gods. Can you imagine that? This Hebrew woman who knows the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob tells these Moabite girls, go back to your idols and your gods, and I'll go my way. Instead of being a faithful witness, she tells them to do that. And Orpah does what she says. She gives her a little peck on the cheek. The Bible says she kisses her, and she turns around and walks away. You know, there's something about an outward sign of loyalty like that. Jesus was betrayed by a kiss, right? Judas outwardly kissed him, but was betraying him at the same moment. And Orpah's kind of kissing Naomi, but in reality, she says, I'm not willing to stick by you. I'm going my way. I'm going to take care of myself. But Ruth says these famous words that have been famous for 1,000 years. She says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. And here's what she says. Your people will be my people. And now listen to her sign of faith. And your God will be my God. In this 10-year period, she's heard them talk about the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And I don't know what story she heard. Surely she heard them talk about Noah. Surely she heard them talk about Isaac. And surely she heard them talk about all these great things. But she said, I believe in your God. She has become a believer. And so they pack up and they move back to Bethlehem. They get to Bethlehem, and Ruth says, I want to go out and glean in the fields. Now, God had given them a kind of an obscure law. In fact, in my daily Bible reading, I've been in the book of Exodus, and I've been going through some of those chapters where you kind of wish you could fast forward and get through, some of those laws. You're like, why do we have to know all of these? But some of those laws were very important for them. One of the laws God said is if you had a farm and you're going to go out there and reap your fields, he said, leave the corners for the poor. So the poor people come, and they've got a place they can go and they can get some food for themselves. Now listen to what God said. God said we ought to give people who are able to work an opportunity to work. God didn't say, go and harvest it for them and dump it on their doorstep. He said if they are able-bodied, give them an opportunity to work. You know what the Bible says in the New Testament? If a man does not work, he shall not eat, right? And some people, I can't tell you how many times I get cussed up and down by people who come in the church and they're able-bodied, nothing wrong with them, and they want me to give them cash. And I said, we don't do that. And I mean, they let me have it. They give me all the, and then they tell me what the church is here for. I want you to understand the church is not to be a free ATM. We're not here just to hand cash out to anybody who doesn't want to work. God says, no, work is not a bad thing. 6 days shall man work, the 7th day shall he rest. He said, you leave those corners for the poor people. Ruth was not asking for a handout. She was just asking for an opportunity. And so she said, Naomi, I want to go out there. Naomi says, all right, go. And she goes out there and she's gleaning in the field. And it just so, I love what the Bible says, she happens to come to the field of Boaz. You know what? I love the fact that I don't believe in such a thing as coincidence. I think that all things, God has a purpose and he does things on purpose and he guides us and directs us. I heard one guy that was saying that he was talking to some friends at work and they weren't believers. And he was talking about prayer and how much he believed in prayer. He said, boy, I mean, God answers prayer. And they said, that's a bunch of coincidence. They said, it just so happens when you pray, these things work out. And it's just a coincidence. He said, all I know is this. When I stop praying, the coincidences stop happening. That's all I know because God is in it, right? And so this was no accident. She comes to the field owned by Boaz. And Boaz, as he's coming, he sees Ruth, and I think it's love at first sight, and he begins to talk to his servants, and they tell him about this woman and her faith and her commitment, how she is stuck by her mother-in-law. She's left her family and all this to come here and to sacrifice to be a support to her mother. And I mean, he hears about her character, and he's beginning to fall in love with her. And he goes and he tells Ruth, he says, don't go to anybody else's fields. You stay in my fields. And then he tells his servants, when you're out collecting stuff, just let some of it fall in front of her so she doesn't have to work too hard because I want to let her know that I love her and I'm showing her some interest. And so she goes home and she's just piled down with all this stuff. And she walks in the door. Naomi says, where did you get all that? She says, I was gleaning in the field of Boaz. And can you imagine? Naomi just goes, oh my goodness, Ruth, Boaz is one of the few people in this world who is in a position to save us. All because of, again, these obscure laws in the Old Testament. And if you studied the book of Ruth, you know it's all about a thing called a kinsman redeemer. There were some laws in the Old Testament that said two things that would happen. They said if a man died and therefore he lost his estate or he sold his estate or whatever, his closest, nearest relative had the right to buy it back. He got first shot to buy back that man's property and his farm. But along with that, if that man left a widow, the person who bought back the farm and the estate had to marry the widow and take her on and support her and provide children for her and a family for her. And so Boaz was this close relative. And so Naomi's just going, you don't understand, Ruth. Out of all the people you could have bumped into, you bumped into this man who was related to my husband Elimelech, one of the few people who's in this position to help us. And she says, so you go back and you let him know that you're interested because Ruth is beginning to fall in love with him. And to make a long story kind of short, he shows her he's interested. She shows him that he's interested. And he says, all right, Ruth, he said, I want to marry you. But he said, there's one thing standing in the way. I'm not the closest relative. He said, there is one other guy that's closer to Elimelech than I am. He's closer, and I've got to make sure that he gets first shot. So he goes and talks to him. He says, do you want to buy this stuff? And the guy said, yes, I do. I mean, how much is it? I want to buy the property. He says, okay, but just so you know, he says, not only do you get the stuff, but you have to marry Ruth in the process. And he said, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. He said, because then if I have children with her, he said, then all of my stuff, instead of going to my other kids, would have to go to her kids. And he said, I don't want to get my inheritance all messed up. No, never mind. And Boaz says, all right, if you don't want it, he says, I do. And he said, you guys be happy. And Boaz goes back, and they get married. And they have a little boy named Obed. And one day Obed's going to grow up and have a little boy named Jesse. And one day Jesse's going to grow up and he's going to have a whole bunch of kids. And the runt of that litter is going to be a guy named King David. And then as the years roll on and on and on, one day in that same little village, one of their descendants is going to be a baby named Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And as you open Matthew chapter 1 and see that genealogy, Ruth's name is there. I love it. Don't you love this Moabite who's outside of the promise and outside of all this, the blessings that God has promised Israel. Instead, God grafts her in because of grace. And it's a beautiful story. So a lot of times when people talk about the book of Ruth, they focus on the symbolic part of it, and they talk about the kinsman redeemer, and how Boaz is a picture of the kinsman redeemer, and Ruth is a picture of the church, the Gentile bride, and all that's wonderful. I've done that before. There's nothing wrong with that. But tonight I want to look at it from a practical standpoint of looking at Ruth and somebody who served God in difficult circumstances, in difficult days. And I want us to notice a few things. And number one is that we must remain faithful. Look at what it says in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. And she says, entreat me not to leave you or turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. To be faithful means to be dependable. It means you can be counted on. It means you can be trusted. I've said it before, but up in Yellowstone National Park, there are dozens and dozens of geysers that nobody could care anything about, because some of those geysers, it may take weeks or months or even years before they go off, but everybody flocks to the one called Old Faithful, because every 90 minutes, just like clockwork, that thing's going to shoot off because you can count on it. You know it's going to be there. You know it's going to be faithful, and Ruth was faithful, and God is looking for faithfulness. In fact, Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6 says, "But who can find a faithful man?" That's what God is looking for. And she was faithful. She said, "Naomi, I'm going to be faithful to you. And even though I'm a new believer, I want to be faithful to my God. I want to be faithful." And God's looking for faithfulness tonight. Number one, He wants us to be faithful to our families. Do you believe that tonight? I hear people say to him sometimes things like this: well, he's married to his work, or she loves this more than anything else. I'm going to tell you what, listen, our job as believers is God is number one and our family is number two. We ought to be faithful to our families. And she said to Naomi, "I'm going to be faithful to you." Faithful to our friends. The book of Proverbs says a friend loves at all times. Through thick and thin, good and bad, a real friend is going to stand by you. Faithful in our finances. Jesus said, if you've not been faithful in unrighteous mammon, in other words, in money, the things we handle, who will commit you true riches? I want to tell you what, how we handle our finances may be the single biggest indicator of our spiritual life. You might say, well, how can you prove that? I don't have to prove it. Jesus proved it. He said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I mean, where our heart is has a lot to say. We're going to examine that based on how we handle our money. He said, well, if a person's faithful in their finances, you'll know that their heart is in the right place. It also tells us to be faithful to our fellowship. He says in the book of Hebrews, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, right? That we're to be faithful to our church fellowship. We're to be faithful to this body that we have. And I want to say that not only is it getting harder and harder, it's a sad thing, harder and harder in these days to find people who are faithful to the house of God. Faithful. You know, when they say when the doors are open, I'm there because I'm going to be faithful to the house of God. But it's harder, especially in America, where we have this consumerism mentality, to find people who say, I'm going to be faithful to my church. We have this buffet mentality. If this church doesn't fit me, there's one over here that will. And if I don't like this, I'll just go over there. And we get this thing going all the time. At our district councils and general councils, we look at all kinds of statistics, and I'm always blown away because you would not believe how many communities in just southern Missouri do not have an AG church whatsoever, and then we got towns that have 15 and 20 on every corner. I mean, and every time somebody wants to start a church, they want to put one right next door to one that's already there. Just last week, I talked to somebody, and they were talking about a church, one of our churches up and outside of Kansas City, and they said it was a small church, but it was doing good, and they said it was growing, and they said, you know what happened last week? When the deacon said he felt God was calling him to start a church right down the block. And they said half the church went with him and half the church stayed. And still now, instead of having a strong church, now they've got two churches that are struggling and can't make their bills. I want to tell you, we ought to be faithful to our family. Say, I'm faithful right here. I'm not going to chase the newest thing. I'm faithful to my family. Not only that, but faithful to the faith. The Bible says in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 13, hold fast to the words which you have heard from me. The words we have heard are these words right here, that we are faithful to this. And I'm not following some new trend, and I'm not following some new idea, but the Bible, that's the book for me, and I'm going to be faithful to that. And faithful in these things, faithful in the small things. Jesus said, if you are faithful in that which is least, you'll be faithful in that which is much. And so we want to be faithful no matter how small it may be. We say, no, I'm going to be faithful in those things and in the secret things. Did you know what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount? He said, if you do something in your secret, your Father that sees what you've done in secret will reward you. So we do it. You say, well, what about, nobody else sees it. That's okay. We don't care about who else sees it. I love what Joseph said. You remember when Potiphar's wife kept seducing him and trying? What did he say? He said, how can I do this thing and sin against God? He said to her, I don't care if anybody else ever knows it. I don't care if it's just you and me that know it. I cannot do this thing because God knows it, and I want to be faithful to Him. I want to tell you, when I think of faithfulness tonight, the picture that I get in my head of faithfulness is the Apostle Paul. The last thing he writes half of the New Testament, and he comes to the last thing, 2 Timothy. And he's writing this last letter, and he picks up his paper, and he picks up his pen, and he's writing to Timothy, who was like his son in the ministry. And he gets to that last chapter, and now he's saying goodbye, because he says, Timothy, I know what's happening. I'm in shackles. I know the Roman emperor's already got my executioner waiting. They're sharpening the sword. I know where I'm headed. I know what's coming. And he said, but I also know this. He said, I have fought the good fight. I have kept the faith. He said, there's a crown waiting for me, not just me, but all those who've loved His appearing. And I think about that, and I imagine what happened after that. When Paul puts the pen down and he walks out into that Colosseum and he gets down on his knees and they put your head on the block and he puts his head on that block and the executioner pulls the sword and brings that sword down and right that on Paul's neck. And you know what I hear? The next thing I think Paul heard were the words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." He was faithful. And God said, even though it ended like that, he said, "You've been faithful. Enter into the joy of your Lord." And so we want to be faithful. Remain faithful, Ruth teaches us. Secondly, is to rely on God. Look what it says in chapter 1, verse 21. Naomi says this. She says, "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty." Sad words from Naomi, but this was a woman who had backslidden. Elimelech and Naomi, they had backslidden. They said, instead of praying, we're going to go down to Moab. Instead of trusting God, we're going to try to fix it ourselves. She told Orpah and Ruth, go back to your own gods. And then she says, this is all God's fault. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me home again empty. She wasn't trusting God. Not one time does the Bible says that Elimelech and Naomi ever got on their knees and asked God to provide. It doesn't say they went and they prayed. It doesn't say they asked God what they wanted him to do. They were just trying to fix it themselves. But Ruth said, I'm going to rely on God. She said, you know what? You may not think God's providing, but I'm going to trust him to provide. Because I think Ruth had heard some stories. I think she'd heard about how 40 years in the wilderness, God provided manna every single day. He didn't take a day off. He didn't skip. He didn't run out. He didn't run dry. God was faithful. And she said, I'm going to rely on God. Here's the third thing she teaches, and that is to reach out in faith. In chapter 2, verse 2, it says, Then Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him. And look at this, in whose sight I may find favor. She said, Naomi, I'm really not sure what's going to happen, but I'm going to put my faith out there. I'm going to trust, and I'm going to step out on faith and try. Faith is just that. It's trusting. And you might think, well, I'm not really a person that has a tremendous amount of faith. You are exercising faith right this very second. You know why? Because you're sitting on those pews. When you came in, you made a decision to trust that pew with your weight. You said, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to trust that this thing isn't going to crack and leave me right on the floor. And that's what faith is. Trusting all of our burdens, all of our problems, and believing that God is going to take care of us. I know when we talk about, I heard of a faith exercise once when, I might have said this at some time before, but I was working with youth. And we'd gone to a retreat at one point. And they said, we want you to do this faith exercise. And there was a platform, maybe a little bit higher than the stage there. And they said, we want you to learn to trust your group. And they said, we're going to get all your kids from your group, youth group over here. They're going to all get their arms out like this. And each of us, we're going to go up on that platform. We're going to turn around backwards. They said, you got to cross your arms like this. And then you just simply fall backwards and your group will catch you. And they said, that's a faith exercise. You build faith in each other. And so that one by one, they begin to get up there and do this. And they called me. They said, you get up there. I said, I am not about to get on that platform and fall backwards into those kids' hands. And they said, why? I said, because this group that we brought, I said, I don't even know half these kids. And I do know the other half. I said, that's why I'm not getting on that platform. I don't trust them. But that's what faith is. It's saying, I'm going to trust. It's not just believing. Believing is different than faith. And I can put it to you like this. Back in the 1800s, there was a guy named Charles Blondin. And he was an acrobat and famous for tightrope walking. And he'd done it many times over Niagara Falls. They had stretched this tightrope across Niagara Falls. And he would go across it. And he'd done it many times, back and forth, back and forth. And then he wanted to up it because people were more excited. So once he took a stove, an actual stove, and strapped it on his back. And he walked across that tightrope carrying that stove. Once he went out there and he cooked food sitting on the tightrope and ate it and got up and walked away. Once he went back through and he carried somebody on his shoulders. And then finally he came out there one day and there was a big crowd of people. Reporters were there, got the cameras and everything. And he had a wheelbarrow and he had some bricks in it. And he pushed the wheelbarrow across Niagara Falls. And he got to the other side where that crowd was. And he said, how many people believe I could take these bricks out and I could put a person in this wheelbarrow and I could push them across Niagara Falls? And everybody's hands went up because they'd just seen him do all these great things. We all believe you can do it. He said, all right, who wants to volunteer to get in the wheelbarrow? And everybody's hand went down, not one person willing to do it. You see, faith is different. Belief is saying, we believe you can do it. Faith is getting in the wheelbarrow and acting on it. That's what faith is. Hebrews chapter 11. It's not just that those people believed. It's by faith they did something. By faith Noah built. By faith Abraham left. By faith Moses parted. They did something by their faith. And so she relied on God. She said, I'm going to reach out in faith. I'm going to not just believe that God can do it, but I'm going to step out and stretch my faith and trust God. And the last thing tonight that she teaches us is that we must rejoice in God's goodness. Chapter 4, verse 17 says, also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed, and he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. This was Naomi's grandson. When it says a son born to Naomi, it's just meaning in her family, in her household. But this was the son of Boaz and Ruth. And did you catch that first line? Boaz didn't come up with the name, and Naomi didn't come up with the name, and Ruth didn't come up with the name. It was the neighbor women who named this little baby. And the reason they did that is because Obed's name means worshiping. And these neighbor women, every time they came past Ruth's house, they saw Ruth out on the porch rocking that baby, and she's worshiping God. And every time they walked past Ruth, she's holding that baby, worshiping God. And so they said, this little kid, we're going to call him worshiping, because Ruth is so overwhelmed by the blessing of God. Every time we see them or see her, she is worshiping. I love that about Ruth. And so that's why he got his name, because Ruth did not overlook God's goodness. She said, God has blessed me, and I want to honor him. And she lived a life of worship. You know what the psalmist says? In fact, David, one of her descendants, he wrote a bunch of those psalms. And one of those psalms says this. It says, and forget not all his benefits. It would have been very easy for Ruth to, as the years roll by, forget that God did this and God did that. But she said, I'm not going to forget it. I'm not ever going to forget it. I'm going to remember every good thing God did, and I'm going to worship him for it. And David not only said that, but one of her descendant, David, also said this one day. He said, I look back over my own life. Remember what he said? Surely goodness and mercy followed me every day of my life. I think he learned to count his blessings from his great-great-great-grandma. I think Grandma Ruth taught him, don't ever forget God's goodness. Go every day and make a list of all the things God has done and worship him for it and rejoice in God's goodness. So here is this woman outside of the promise, outside of the blessing. She's a Gentile. She's an outcast. But still the arms of God were open wide, and she came and became a believer, and God blessed her, and God poured out his goodness and his mercy upon her and grafted her into even the genealogy of our own Lord and Savior. And she's a wonderful picture of hope in really, really dark days, that we can still be faithful to God and make a difference no matter what the world around us is like. No matter if our world is just as dark as it was in the day of Judges, we can still be that bright spot in the darkness like Ruth was. Did you stand tonight with your heads bowed and eyes closed? And let me tell you tonight, Ruth taught us some great lessons. Just a small story, but what great lessons that she taught us tonight. That we've got to remain faithful. That no matter what we do in our lives, we have to be like Ruth and say, I will. My God, I will be faithful. I'm not going to make my decisions based on my circumstances, but every day I will make a choice to be faithful. And every day I'm going to make a choice to rely on God. He brought food to Elijah from a raven, and then from a widow. He brought manna for 40 years in the wilderness. And his shelves are never empty. He can provide for us. He can take care of us. We can reach out in faith and say, I trust him. I don't just believe. The Bible says even the devil believes and trembles. I don't just believe a set of facts, but I want to act on that faith and walk by faith and not by sight every day, trusting the Lord and rejoicing in his goodness and getting up every morning and not rehearsing my problems and not rehearsing my gripes and not rehearsing my troubles, but rehearsing God's goodness and looking over my shoulder and say, Lord, every day goodness and mercy has followed me. Every day you have blessed me, and help us to be like Ruth, a worshiper every day who is thanking you for your goodness to us. Could you find a place to pray tonight and come and get alone with the Lord and say, Lord, I want to be like Ruth. I want to be a bright spot in a dark world. I want to be a ray of hope in darkness and despair. I want to be somebody that's faithful to you no matter what the rest of the world is like.